Did branch banking restrictions impede the growth of manufacturing industries in the early 20th century US states? The early 20th century United States provides a unique setting, a single national economy, but with highly fragmented state-level banking institutions. During this period, some states allowed branch banking, while others enforced unit banking, creating substantial variation in credit conditions. So I like to answer, did the structure of local banking systems shape which industries should grow, innovate, or even survive? Motivations and context. On the left, we see that manufacturing output grew rapidly between 1899 and 1929, more than tripling over the period, despite short-term fluctuations around the 1921 recession. This reflects a period of substantial industrial expansion and structural transformation in the United States. On the right, we observe a simultaneous expansion in branch banking. The number of banks operating branches increased dramatically, particularly after 1910, reflecting an evolving financial structure despite the persistence of restrictive unit banking regimes in many states. While these parallel trends do not imply causality, they highlight that the industrial expansion occurred alongside significant changes in banking organization. This raises the central question of whether differences in banking structure may have influenced industrial growth, particularly for industries reliant on external finance. This project is relevant for two main reasons. First, it contributes to understanding regional divergence. In the early 20th century, US states differed significantly in their industrial structure and institutional environments. If banking institutions affected access to credit, they may have influenced why some regions industrialized more rapidly than others. Second, it speaks directly to the broader finance and growth literature. A large body of research suggests that financial development promotes economic growth, but the mechanisms and institutional channels remain debated. By focusing on branch banking structures and industry-level finance dependence, this project examines how specific institutional features shaped real economic outcomes. Conceptually, the mechanism is straightforward. Banking institutions influence access to credit, which affects firms' investment decisions, and ultimately industrial growth. My project examines whether this mechanism operated differently across industries with varying reliance on external finance. The relevant literature falls into three broad strands. First, the finance growth literature examines how financial development shapes industrial growth, particularly through differences in industries' reliance on external finance. Second, historical work on US banking shows how branching restrictions influence credit allocation and financial stability. Third, state industry approaches in economic history demonstrate how institutional differences generate heterogeneous sectoral outcomes. My project sits at the intersection of these three strands. Financial development and industrial growth. This first strand establishes the broader finance growth relationship. The literature shows that deeper financial systems are associated with stronger, long-run economic growth. However, a key methodological development is the recognition that industries differ in their reliance on external finance. Rather than finance affecting the whole economy uniformly, the evidence suggests that financially developed environments disproportionately benefit industries that depend more heavily on external capital. This introduces the idea of industry heterogeneity as central to understanding how financial systems shape real outcomes. My project builds directly on this insight by applying the heterogeneity framework to the fragmented US banking system of the early 20th century. Moving on to banking structure. The second strand focuses more specifically on banking market structure and how it influences economic performance. This literature shows that branching, competition, and local banking organization affect credit allocation, regional credit availability, and the nature of lending relationships. Importantly, the organization of banking systems shapes not just the quantity of credit supplied, but how it is distributed across firms and regions. In the US context, branching restrictions vary significantly across states, creating meaningful institutional differences in credit markets. This suggests that state-level banking structure may have influenced industrial development through credit allocation mechanisms. Next, looking at state industry approaches, the third strand provides the empirical framework. Economic history research demonstrates that industries were unevenly distributed across states and responded differently to local institutional environments. By using state industry panels, researchers can exploit cross-sectoral heterogeneity within states, rather than relying solely on aggregate state-level outcomes. This framework allows us to examine whether institutional differences generate heterogeneous sectoral responses. My dissertation adopts this approach to test whether externally finance-dependent industries perform differently in states with more developed branch banking systems. Taken together, these literatures suggest that banking institutions should matter more for some industries than others. However, existing historical work typically treats manufacturing as homogeneous and focuses on aggregate state outcomes. While the industry heterogeneity framework developed by Rajan and Zingales has not been applied to the fragmented early 20th century US banking system, this project addresses that gap by combining state-level banking variation with industry-level external finance dependence. The analysis uses a state-industry panel for the United States between 1899 and 1929, observed at decadal intervals. Industry outcomes are measured using manufacturing output and value added. Banking structure is captured using a continuous measure of branch banking intensity, reflecting realized branch networks, rather than legal permissibility alone. Industry external finance dependence is measured using the Rajan-Zingales framework and treated as an industry characteristic. This diagram illustrates the state industry panel framework. Each cell represents the industry within a state at a given point in time. The key idea is that I exploit variation across industries in their external finance dependence and variation across states in their branching structures. By interacting these two dimensions, I plan to identify whether externally dependent industries grew differently in states with more developed branch banking systems, while controlling for unobserved state, industry, and time effects. This will allow me to estimate heterogeneous effects rather than average impacts across the economy. The advantages and drawbacks of this approach are shown on the slide. I chose this approach as this framework is widely used in the finance growth and economic history literatures, including Rajan and Zingales, Ceccarelli and Gambera, and Michener and Wheelock. A key concern is that industry growth may reflect demand shocks rather than credit conditions. To address this, I include a Bartik-style control that combines national industry growth rates with each state's initial industry composition. This captures predicted demand-driven growth at the state industry level, allowing the analysis to better isolate the role of banking institutions. Additionally, I plan to add a Bartik or shift share control into my model. Again, the advantages and drawbacks are shown. Shift share controls are now standard in applied economic history and regional economics when demand-side confounding is a concern. Looking at the empirical model, this model estimates manufacturing growth at the state industry level. The key term is the interaction between branch banking structure and industry external finance dependence, shown in blue. The coefficient on this interaction captures whether externally dependent industries grow differently in states with more developed branching networks. I include state, industry, and year-fixed effects to control for time-invariant differences and common shocks. A Bartik-style control accounts for national industry demand trends. Looking at progress so far and the next steps to be taken. So far, I've completed the literature review and I've sourced the necessary historical data, including generating a state industry panel covering US manufacturing between 1899 and 1929. I have merged this with measures of industry external finance dependence as well as banking structure. I have also identified the empirical strategy, drawing on a state industry fixed effects framework. The next steps are to estimate the baseline panel specifications, incorporate Bartik-style demand controls, and conduct robustness checks using alternative banking measures. I will then interpret the results in light of the historical and institutional context discussed earlier, before writing up the findings and completing the project. To conclude, this project asks whether variation in US branch banking structures affected industrial development in the early 20th century, and whether these effects differed across industries with varying reliance on external finance. Based on the literature and the empirical framework developed, the expectation is that branching institutions relax financing constraints more for externally dependent industries. By combining a state industry panel with demand controls, the project aims to provide new evidence on how financial institutions shaped industrial growth in this historical setting.